12 years ago, a small town in Canada went to sleep and woke up in flames. 47 people never came home. And the most disturbing part is not what happened. It is how long it had been building before anyone stopped it. Subscribe, stay with us until the end, because every part of this story changes what you think you know. Lac-Megantic sits in the eastern townships of Quebec, tucked into the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, about an hour and a half east of the city of Sherbrooke. It is the kind of place that people from cities imagine when they think of the word peaceful. A glacial lake stretches out at the edge of the downtown, clean and wide, its name taken from an ancient Abenaki word meaning place where the fish are held. Forests roll over the surrounding hills. In summer, the air smells like pine and earth. The region draws tourists from across Quebec and from over the border in Maine, which is just 30 minutes away. The town itself is small, just under 6,000 people. Its downtown is a single main street, Rue Frontenac, lined with 2- and 3-story buildings with ground-floor cafes, shops, a post office, a library. It is the kind of downtown where everybody knows everybody, where you stop to talk on the sidewalk, where Friday night out means live music at a bar and the same faces you have known for years. The town had been built around its railway line since the late 1880s, when Canadian Pacific Railway ran its transcontinental route straight through the center, connecting Montreal to the Atlantic coast of New Brunswick. The railway had given the town its reason to exist. It had grown its logging industry, its granite quarries, its small factories. By the early 21st century, passenger trains were long gone, but freight trains still rumbled through the heart of downtown several times a week, meters from homes, meters from the bars and cafes where people gathered on summer evenings. Nobody thought much of it. It had always been that way. On the night of Friday, July 5th, the Music Cafe was full. It was Lac-Megantic's most beloved gathering place, a bar and music venue on Rue Frontenac, just steps from the railway tracks. That night, as it was most Friday nights, the place was packed with locals, teachers, factory workers, young couples, friends who had known each other since school. There was live music. People were drinking, laughing, dancing. One man, who had been there all evening, decided to leave just after 1 in the morning. He said goodbye to his friends, walked out the front door, and headed home. He had no idea what he was about to witness. But before we get to what happened that night, we need to go back. Not just to the hours before the disaster, but to the years before it. Because what came crashing through the center of Lac-Megantic did not come out of nowhere. To understand this disaster, you first need to understand the world that produced it. In the early years of the 21st century, something shifted dramatically in North America's energy landscape. New drilling techniques unlocked enormous reserves of crude oil deep beneath the plains of North Dakota, in a geological formation called the Bakken Shale. The oil boom that followed was staggering in its scale. Production soared. Refineries on the east coast of Canada and the United States suddenly needed massive quantities of this crude. But there was a problem. Pipelines could not be built fast enough to carry all of it. So the industry turned to the next best option, the railways. Within just a few years, crude oil went from being a minor part of the freight rail business to one of its most profitable cargo types. Thousands of tank cars began rolling across North America every single week, carrying millions of liters of volatile crude oil through the centers of towns and cities, over rivers and through valleys, across every kind of terrain. The railway companies loved it. The money was extraordinary, and almost none of the regulatory frameworks that govern the railways had been designed with this kind of cargo in mind. The rules had not kept up. The infrastructure had not kept up, and in many cases, neither had the companies doing the hauling. This is where Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic Railway enters the picture. Known simply as MMA, it was a small American-owned short line carrier that had acquired a stretch of former Canadian Pacific track in Quebec in the early 2000s. The line ran from a junction near Montreal all the way east through the Appalachian foothills of Quebec, crossing into Maine, and eventually connecting to a refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. It was a beautiful route in geography. In operational terms, it was a nightmare. The tracks MMA inherited were aging and poorly maintained. By the time of the disaster, speed restrictions had been placed on 23 separate sections of the line. In some places, trains had to crawl at barely 10 miles per hour over stretches that were technically unsafe at normal speeds. Weeds grew through rotting railroad ties where the ballast had not been properly replaced in years. The locomotives themselves were in rough shape, frequently experiencing mechanical problems that would have grounded them at a better-run company. And the workforce had been stripped to the bone. Aggressive cost-cutting had reduced staff to the absolute minimum needed to keep trains moving, eliminating the safety redundancy that a second pair of eyes on a long run could provide. But the most consequential cost-cutting measure MMA made was one that regulators had actually approved. The company became one of the first railways in Canada to run trains carrying dangerous goods, including crude oil, with a single crew member. Just one person, alone in the cab, responsible for a train that could stretch nearly a kilometer and weigh more than 10,000 tons. Industry lobbying had successfully argued that modern technology made a second crew member unnecessary. The regulators agreed. By the time this policy was in place, there was the equivalent of one federal safety inspector for every 4,500 tank car loads of dangerous goods moving through Canada. A decade earlier, that same inspector had been responsible for 14 loads. The oversight had not just thinned, it had nearly vanished. The crude oil itself carried a hidden danger that almost nobody in Lac-Megantic knew about. Bakken Formation crude, the oil coming out of North Dakota, is not like the thick, sluggish petroleum most people picture. It is light, extraordinarily volatile, and releases flammable gases at room temperature. It ignites easily and burns violently. Yet on official shipping documentation, it was frequently classified as a lower hazard grade of petroleum, deliberately understating its true danger. Regulators in both Canada and the United States had discovered that crude was being routinely misclassified, but enforcement was slow and the oil kept moving. And the tanks it traveled in were not designed for it. The tank cars used across the industry for hauling this crude were known as DOT 111s. They had originally been designed to carry agricultural products like corn syrup. Their shells were thin and largely unprotected. Both the American and Canadian Transportation Safety Boards had issued formal warnings about these cars for years, pointing out that in any serious derailment, they were prone to rupturing catastrophically, not leaking slowly but tearing wide open and releasing their entire contents at once. The warnings had produced policy discussions, recommendations, and committees. They had not produced new tank cars. The DOT 111s remained the industry standard. And so, on the evening of Friday, July 5th, a train called M02 rolled out of a Canadian Pacific yard near Montreal, carrying 72 of these tank cars, each loaded with roughly 113,000 liters of Bakken crude oil. Combined with the 5 locomotives pulling the train and a buffer car between the engines and the tanks, the total length of the train was nearly a kilometer. The total weight was more than 10,000 tons. Its destination was the refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. Its route ran directly through the heart of Lac-Megantic. The engineer on train MMA002 that evening was Tom Harding. He was a veteran railway man, experienced and professional, with decades on the line. He had made this particular run dozens of times before. He knew the route, he knew the territory, and he knew, from the moment he climbed into the cab that afternoon in Farnham, Quebec, that something was not right with the lead locomotive. The engine pulling the train, number 5017, had been showing problems for days. Its diesel motor was misfiring. In the days before the disaster, another engineer had reported the same issue on a previous run. The locomotive had smoked badly, behaved erratically, and shown the kind of symptoms that should have taken it off the line for repairs. Nothing had been done. The locomotive had simply been put back into service. The underlying cause, investigators would later determine, was a broken piston inside the engine that had been allowing oil to build up inside the turbocharger. Over time, that oil had been overheating. The engine was quietly building toward fire. That evening, as Harding guided the enormous train through the Appalachian foothills toward the crew change point at Knott's, the lead locomotive was spitting heavy black and white smoke from its exhaust. The smell of burning oil was strong. Harding contacted MMA's rail traffic controller in Farnham and reported the problem. The response from the company was to leave the train parked overnight as planned, keep the lead locomotive running at idle to maintain the air brake system, and deal with the locomotive in the morning when a maintenance team could look at it. These were the instructions Harding followed. Nantes is a small rural community 11 kilometers west of Lac-Megantic. The railway runs through it alongside Highway 161, a quiet two-lane road through the hills. The designated parking spot for MMA crews doing a changeover here was on the main line, not on the adjacent siding. The siding, which would have been a safer place to leave the train overnight, was routinely blocked by stored boxcars belonging to a local factory. So Harding parked the train on the main line, on a grade that descended toward Lac-Megantic. He secured the locomotives by setting the air brakes, and he applied handbrakes on 7 of the train's cars. MMA's own minimum standard called for 9. Independent engineering analysis would later conclude that for the weight and the slope of this particular location, somewhere closer to 15 handbrakes would have been the appropriate number. Harding set 7. He believed it was sufficient, and he had been given no specific guidance otherwise. He called in to report the train was secure, and he took a taxi down to a hotel in Lac-Megantic. The taxi driver later recalled that Harding smelled of oil that night, and that the windshield of the cab had been spattered with droplets of petroleum blown from the locomotive as he climbed in. Harding told the driver he was uneasy about the locomotive. He said he intended to call the American office of MMA from the hotel to report the situation. What he could not have known was that within the hour, events had already moved beyond anything a phone call could fix. At approximately 1:45 p.m, a passing motorist on Highway 161 noticed something alarming. The lead locomotive of the parked train was on fire. Flames were visible from the cab. The motorist called emergency services, and the Nantes Fire Department responded. Their protocol for a locomotive fire was standard: shut down the engine to cut the fuel supply feeding the blaze, then fight the fire. They followed their protocol exactly. They shut off locomotive 5017. They extinguished the fire. They notified MMA's traffic controller in Farnham, who did not send Harding back to the scene. Instead, the company dispatched a track maintenance foreman, a man whose job involved the physical condition of the rails and ties, not the mechanical operation of locomotives, and certainly not the technical functioning of air brake systems. By just after midnight, the maintenance foreman and a colleague had arrived at the scene. They looked over the train, confirmed to the traffic controller that everything appeared to be in order, and reported the situation secure. The firefighters had already left. The police officer who had attended the scene left shortly after. The maintenance workers departed. The train sat alone in the dark on the hill above Lac-Megantic. But something had changed with the extinguishing of that fire that no one on the scene fully understood. With the lead locomotive shut down, there was no longer any engine running to power the air compressor that maintained pressure in the air brake system. Air brakes on freight trains are not like the brakes on a car. They are held on by compressed air, and when the pressure drops, the brakes release. The system is designed with this in mind. The air reservoirs on each car can hold pressure for a significant period of time, but they were never designed to hold indefinitely against a steady downhill grade on a train of this weight with only 7 handbrakes providing mechanical resistance. Very slowly, over the course of the next hour, the air pressure bled away. The reservoirs drained. The automatic brakes grew weaker. The 7 handbrakes held their position, but their grip was fighting a battle against physics they were losing with every passing minute. At approximately 12:56 in the morning on July 6th, the train began to move. It started almost imperceptibly, 10,000 tons of steel and oil on a gentle slope with nothing left to stop them. The movement was slow at first, barely a creep, the kind of almost nothing shift that might have been stopped entirely if anyone had been present to throw a single additional brake. But there was no one there, and the hill took over. The track from Nantes to Lac-Megantic descends continuously through the Appalachian foothills, curving through dark forest and open farmland, dropping steadily toward the lakeshore where the town sits. 11 kilometers of track, most of it falling away downward, and nothing to slow what was now a fully runaway freight train. There were no automated sensors on this stretch of line to detect an unexpected movement and trigger an alarm. There was no signal that would alert the traffic controller in Farnham to the fact that this train had begun to roll. There was simply the darkness and the sound of steel on steel slowly building. The train accelerated. By the time it crossed through the last stretch of countryside before the outskirts of town, it was moving at over 100 kilometers per hour. The speed limit on the curve it was approaching, the tight left-hand curve at the center of Lac-Megantic, where Frontenac Street crosses the railway, was 16 kilometers per hour. The man who had left the music cafe a few minutes earlier, Gillis Flute, was on foot nearby when the train passed him in the dark. He heard it before he saw it. Or rather, he heard the absence of it. No engine sound, just the screaming grind of wheels on rails, a roar growing impossibly fast. The train passed within 50 meters of him in complete darkness. No headlights, no warning, a black wall of steel moving at highway speed through the streets of a sleeping town. He understood immediately what he was looking at. He yelled to anyone within earshot to run. He described it afterward as a black blob that came out of nowhere, moving at a hellish speed, with no lights, no signals, and no warning at all. The train hit the curve, and the laws of physics did the rest. 63 of the 72 tank cars left the rails. Some of them tore straight through the curve and plowed into the buildings along Frontenac Street. Others jackknifed and piled over each other. The shells of those thin-walled tank cars ruptured on impact with a violence that exceeded anything their designers had contemplated. Not a slow crack or a puncture, but a full-bore catastrophic breach. 6 million liters of crude oil poured out across the streets of downtown Lac-Megantic in seconds. It flowed into the gutters, down the sidewalks, under the doors of the buildings, into the sewer system beneath the streets, and directly into the lake. The ignition was instantaneous. The first explosion lifted a fireball 3 times the height of the surrounding buildings. The heat was immediate and overwhelming. 4 to 5 further explosions followed in rapid succession as additional tank cars ruptured and ignited. The music cafe, where 30 people were still inside when the train hit, was consumed almost instantly. Witnesses in the surrounding streets described the sky turning from black to a blinding orange, brighter than midday, in the space of a heartbeat. One survivor who had been inside the bar and managed to escape described the moment of impact. The room went pitch black, then turned orange, an orange so bright and violent it was unlike anything natural, and then there was nothing but fire. The fire chief for Lac-Megantic, Denis Lauzon, was awoken in his home by the explosions. He opened his front door and looked out at a sky on fire. His response, he said later, was simply, "We are in hell." The firefighters who arrived in those first minutes could not advance. The heat from burning crude oil at this scale is not survivable at close range. The asphalt of the streets themselves began to burn. In the first weeks of cleanup, investigators could only work in 15-minute shifts due to the concentration of benzene filling the air. Emergency responders from across Quebec and from across the border in Maine came to assist. They evacuated 2,000 residents from the surrounding streets in the dark of the night. But the 47 people who died in those first minutes could not be reached. 30 of them were inside the music cafe. Tom Harding was awoken in his hotel room by the explosions. He went to a window, looked out at the fire consuming the center of the town he had driven into that evening, and began calling the railway dispatcher. At 1:47 in the morning, he reached the dispatcher and described what he was seeing. "Everything is on fire, from the church all the way down to the metro, from the river all the way to the railway tracks." He did not yet know it was his train. It was not until nearly 3:30 in the morning that the dispatcher told him. His recorded reaction has been documented in the investigation transcripts. He said, "She was secure. She was secure." The fire burned for 2 days. When it was over, more than 30 buildings in the center of Lac-Megantic had been destroyed outright. Of the 39 structures still standing in the downtown area, all but 3 would eventually have to be demolished, the ground beneath them so saturated with crude oil and benzene that no building could safely remain. The blast had been visible from space, detected by a NASA satellite monitoring the Earth's surface at night. What investigators found over the 13 months that followed was not the story of one man's mistake. It was the story of a system that had been silently coming apart for years, and a night when every single layer of protection failed at the same time. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada, known as the TSB, led the investigation. When they published their report, they identified not one cause, not two, not five, but 18 distinct causes and contributing factors. 18 separate failures, each of which individually might not have been fatal, but which combined to produce the night of July 6th. What the report described was not a company that had made one bad decision, but an entire operating culture that had normalized risk to the point where disaster had become a matter of time. The locomotive, number 5017, had shown the same fault days before the disaster on a previous run. Another engineer had reported it. Nothing had been repaired. The broken piston was allowed to continue accumulating oil in the turbocharger until it caught fire on the hill above Lac-Megantic. This was not an unforeseen mechanical failure. It was a known problem that had been deferred. The handbrake's Harding set, 7, where the situation required at minimum 9 by MMA's own rules and closer to 15 by proper engineering standards for that slope, reflected a broader failure of the company to give its engineers clear and specific guidance about brake requirements for different grades and tonnages. The rule was vague. The training was inadequate. The culture within MMA was one where individual employees were expected to exercise judgment in situations that demanded documented, tested procedures. The fire department in Nantes had followed its protocol exactly. That protocol said, shut off the engine to cut fuel to the fire. It did not say to first verify that the handbrakes alone were sufficient to hold the train on the grade, because once the air system loses power, the train is held only by its mechanical brakes. The fire department had no reason to know that. They had received no railway-specific training about the relationship between locomotive operation and brake pressure on a loaded freight train. That gap was not their fault. It was a regulatory failure. The track maintenance foreman who was sent to the scene instead of allowing Harding to return, a man who confirmed to the traffic controller that the train was safe when he had no technical basis to make that assessment, was in an impossible position. He had been placed there by a company decision that prioritized leaving the engineer in his hotel room over sending the one person who actually understood how the air brake system functioned. The oil itself had been misclassified on its shipping documents, recorded as a less volatile grade of petroleum than the highly flammable Bakken crude it actually was. This was not a small clerical error. It meant that emergency responders across the entire route had been given inaccurate information about the nature of the cargo they might one day face. And the DOT, 111 tank cars ruptured in the derailment at a rate that shocked even the investigators. 94% of the derailed cars were breached. More than half of them were torn open to the full diameter of the tank, not cracked, not punctured, but shredded. At the regulatory level, the TSB found that Transport Canada's oversight of MMA had been, in the investigators' careful language, ineffective. The single operator policy had been approved and implemented without adequate assessment of what would happen when that one person was no longer present. The railway had been operating under a system that trusted companies to self-regulate their safety practices, with inspections that had become increasingly rare and increasingly superficial. MMA had a documented history of safety issues. Regulators knew about them. The trains kept running. 3 men were charged with criminal negligence causing death: Tom Harding, the engineer; Richard Labrie, the traffic controller in Farnham; and Jean DeMater, MMA's manager of train operations. They were arrested, handcuffed, and charged with offenses that carried the possibility of a life sentence. The case went to trial in the autumn of 2017, nearly 4.5 years after the disaster. After a 3-month trial and 9 days of jury deliberation, all 3 men were acquitted. The jury found that while errors had been made, those errors did not rise to the level of criminal negligence. The defense had argued throughout the trial that these 3 individuals had been placed inside a system so thoroughly broken that holding them personally responsible for its failure was fundamentally unjust. The father of one of the victims, who had attended the entire trial, said outside the courthouse that he was satisfied with the verdict. He said these men were not the ones who should have been standing there. He believed the people who deserved to answer for his daughter's death had never set foot in a courtroom. No executive at MMA was ever charged. No regulator. No government official. The company's chairman, who had overseen years of aggressive cost-cutting while the safety record deteriorated, was never prosecuted. In a second, separate proceeding, Harding received 6 months of house arrest for a railway safety regulation violation. A subsidiary of MMA was fined $1 million for polluting the lake and the river. These were the only sentences handed down. MMA itself declared bankruptcy 2 months after the disaster. Its assets were sold at auction and rebranded under a new name. The company that had operated this line simply ceased to exist, taking its liabilities with it. A compensation fund of approximately 460 million Canadian dollars was eventually established for victims in the town, drawn from a combination of insurance settlements, contributions from other railway companies in the cargo chain, and government funds. It took years of legal battles to reach. The immediate aftermath transformed Lac-Megantic into something that resembled a war zone more than a town. The entire downtown area was sealed behind security fencing and declared a red zone, inaccessible to the public for nearly a year while a massive decontamination operation began. The soil beneath the streets had to be removed. The foundations of demolished buildings had to be excavated. The contamination extended beneath properties whose structures were still standing, making them uninhabitable even though the fire had not touched them. Some residents were told it could take 5 years before their land would be safe to rebuild on. 100 people could not return to their homes until well into the following year. The environmental damage ran further than the town boundaries. Crude oil had seeped into the lake, contaminating the shoreline and the water. It had entered the Chaudière River and flowed downstream for 80 kilometers, forcing emergency water restrictions across multiple communities. The river ecosystem faced years of recovery work. The full scale of the soil and groundwater contamination beneath downtown would not be understood for months. The town itself faced a question that no amount of compensation could fully answer. Will you rebuild, and where, when the ground your downtown stood on is toxic? The community was given a voice in the process. Residents said they wanted green space where buildings had burned. They wanted solar energy infrastructure. They wanted less light pollution. They wanted a new boat launch that would protect the lake's water quality. They wanted a town that reflected not just what had been lost, but what they believed their home should become. The rebuild was slow, difficult, and at times halted entirely when funding ran out or contractors could not be paid. But it moved forward. The Music Cafe reopened in December of 2014, 17 months after the disaster, in a new location just beyond the railway tracks. Its owner, Yannick Gagné, had left the bar about 40 minutes before the train arrived on the night of July 6th. He watched the explosion from his bedroom window. He spent more than $1 million of his own money rebuilding the place, fought battles with banks and government agencies, and came close to giving up more than once. He reopened because he said the town needed it. The new Music Cafe became a symbol of what the community was trying to do, not erase the past, but refuse to be defined by it entirely. A memorial was built on the site where the original cafe had stood, beside the railway tracks. It includes a granite plaque bearing the names of the 47 who died, made from the same granite that has long been quarried in this region and that had been used in memorials around the world, including in New York City. It now carries the names of people who had simply been sitting in a bar on a Friday night when the world arrived without warning. The railway tracks continued to run through the center of Lac-Mégantic for 5 more years after the disaster. Old trains still passed through. Residents could hear them from their homes, from the rebuilt cafes, from the memorial that sat beside the rails. The idea of rerouting the line away from the downtown had been discussed as far back as the 1970s and abandoned because of cost. It was raised again immediately after the disaster, supported passionately by the community and its elected officials, and resisted for years by the railway industry for the same reason it had always been resisted. It was not until 2018, 5 years after the fire, that the federal and provincial governments officially committed to building a bypass route around the town. The regulatory response was significant. Transport Canada banned the operation of trains carrying dangerous goods with a single crew member. It rewrote the rules on handbrake securement, requiring specific numbers based on grade and tonnage rather than leaving the calculation to individual judgment. It issued directives prohibiting unattended trains carrying hazardous materials from being left on main lines. In the United States, regulators launched a decade-long phase-out of the DOT, 111 tank cars for hazardous cargo. But critics, including former investigators and transportation safety researchers, have continued to argue that the systemic conditions that produced the disaster had not been fundamentally changed. A rail industry that had grown accustomed to prioritizing cost over safety, a regulatory framework that had become progressively more deferential to the companies it was supposed to oversee. A political environment in which the expansion of oil by rail was treated as an economic priority rather than a public safety question. These things did not disappear with the new rules. There is a question that Lac-Megantic poses that has never been fully answered. It is not a technical question about handbrakes or air pressure or tank car design. Those questions were answered. The question is this: across North America, thousands of kilometers of freight rail lines pass directly through the centers of cities and towns, carrying volatile crude oil and hazardous chemicals and aging equipment, through populated areas that have no emergency plans built for a worst-case derailment, overseen by regulatory frameworks under permanent pressure from the industries they regulate. Not all of those routes are Lac-Megantic, but some of them are waiting. 47 people went to a bar on a summer Friday night in a town they loved, in a place they felt completely safe, and they never came home. Their names are carved in granite beside the railway tracks in the center of a rebuilt downtown. The trains still run nearby. The lake is clear again. The grass has grown back over the places where the fire burned. And 12 years on, the town of Lac-Megantic is still here, smaller than it was, quieter than it was, changed in ways that will never be fully undone.